This 11-year-old horror film killer Toon scared me to death. If it weren't for a viewer request, I don't think I would have ever touched this film in my lifetime. From start to finish, I screamed 12 times, shut my eyes 35 times, and every time the eerie background music played, I instinctively held my phone at arm's length as if keeping it farther away would make me safer. Can you imagine a grown man, terrified, curled up in the corner like a scared little kid? Yeah, that was me. But as terrifying as it was, I have to admit the film was absolutely mind-blowing. Twists and turns at every corner, a non-stop roller coaster of suspense that kept me guessing right until the very last second. The story begins in South Korea, 2013. Ji-yoon is a famous webtoon artist known for her horror revenge stories. To make her work stand out, she has a bizarre habit every time she finishes a series. She pricks her finger and signs her name in her own blood. But on this particular night, after sending her latest draft to her editor, strange things start happening. When the editor opens the file, she notices something unsettling. The main character in the manga looks exactly like her. Even creepier, the character's actions are perfectly synchronized with her own movements. Disturbed but curious, she keeps reading. The first chapter takes place in 1987, where a young girl's mother suffers a gruesome accident, leaving half her face horrifically disfigured, with exposed teeth and rotting flesh. Because of this, the girl is relentlessly bullied at school, branded as the monster's daughter. Over time, she grows to resent her mother, blaming her for everything. One day, in a fit of rage, she scratches out her mother's face in a family photo and writes in her diary, "It would be better if I didn't have a mother." That night, her mother stumbles upon the diary entry. Devastated, she takes her own life. The girl rushes in, initially panicking and trying to save her, but then, she hesitates. Her mother's scarred face reminds her of all the bullying she endured. The voices of her classmates echo in her head. And so, she lets go. She watches as her mother dies right before her eyes. At this point, the editor is full on freaking out. She frantically dials Ji-yoon, but the call won't go through. Shaken, she sends a desperate voice message. "How do you know this story?" Because here's the terrifying truth: the little girl in the story was her. A dark secret she had buried for years was now exposed, drawn into a manga for the whole world to see. Anger and fear consume her, but before she can process it, the room goes dark, the curtains close on their own. Then, silence. Terrified, she grabs a utility knife from her desk, but the next moment, her computer screen flickers to life. The manga is still running, and the events on screen are happening in real time. Now in a full-blown panic, she bolts for the door, but no matter how hard she pounds on it, it won't budge. It's as if she's been sealed inside, with no escape. She grips the knife tighter and shouts, demanding to know who's behind this. The answer comes in the form of a voice, one that sounds exactly like her mother's dying moans. Before she can react, the manga starts playing on its own again. The next morning, she is found dead in her office. Detective Kichiol arrives at the scene. Surveillance footage confirms that after 10 p.m., no one entered or left the building. Detective Kichiol instructed his assistant, Yansu, to file a report classifying the case as a suicide. His colleague calls him over to the computer, and there it is. Her death pose is identical to the one in Ji-yoon's manga. Something isn't right. Kichiol immediately had the body sent to the forensic lab for examination. Surprisingly, the autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was indeed suicide. The wound patterns indicated that the victim had stabbed herself multiple times, ultimately severing her carotid artery and bleeding out. However, one detail baffled the examiner: the victim's face had been slashed 21 times. All of these wounds were inflicted while she was still alive. What kind of mindset would drive someone to choose such an agonizing way to die? As Kichiol listened to the report, he pulled out his phone and stared at the Webtoon panel. The editor's death pose was identical to the scene in Ji-yoon's manga. There had to be a connection. Meanwhile, Ji-yoon is struggling with her own terrifying experiences. She's been waking up in random places with no memory of how she got there. Worse, her nightmares feel too real, especially the one where she comes face to face with the ghost of a little girl from her manga. When she wakes up, her ring is missing. The scar on her finger, which she can't remember getting, looks fresh. A doctor tells her she's suffering from Alice in Wonderland syndrome, a condition where the lines between fiction and reality blur. The only cure? Stop creating horror stories and take a break. But before she can process it, Detective Kichiol arrives at her doorstep. He tells her about the editor's death. The last call the editor made was to Ji-yoon, and the death scene was exactly the same as Ji-yoon's unpublished manga. Therefore, Ki-cheol suspected it was a copycat crime and asked who else had seen the manuscript. Hearing this, Ji-yoon immediately shook her head and said, "That's impossible. The manga was never published." Ji-yoon explained, "The first thing I did after finishing it was send it to my editor for review. That means only the two of us ever saw it. In other words, the possibility of a copycat crime is almost zero." Additionally, after sending the manuscript to the editor last night, she immediately turned off her phone and went to sleep, so she never received the editor's call. In truth, Ji-yoon was lying. She had actually gone out last night and mysteriously woke up on the side of the road the next morning, with no memory of how she got there, but for some reason, she lies to the detective. When Ji-yoon heard the editor's frantic voice message questioning her, she felt a deep sense of shock. Her fictional horror story is happening in real life. In a panic, she rushes to check the second chapter of her manga. At a hospital morgue, an undertaker named Seon-ji is preparing a corpse for burial. But this isn't just any corpse, the body is completely charred, stiff as iron, from an electrocution. No matter how hard he tries, he can't straighten out its limbs. Frustrated, he takes a swig of alcohol just as the lights flicker. When he turns back, the body has moved. Seon-ji was momentarily stunned. He quickly turned around to double check, but this time, the corpse's eyes suddenly snapped open. Frozen in fear, he covers the face with a towel, but then, his tablet screen lights up, showing the next pages of Ji-yoon's manga. As he reads, his face goes pale, because the story on screen? It's his own past. Years ago, his wife had been terminally ill. After 5 long years of caring for her, when she finally died, instead of mourning, he felt relieved. But just as he was preparing her body, she moved. Realizing she was still alive, he made a decision. Rather than go through another round of caregiving, he wrapped her up, tightened the cloth, and suffocated her. At this moment, the camera cuts back to Seon-ji, staring at the manga, a story identical to his own. Panic-stricken, he hurriedly gathered his things, ready to flee the eerie morgue, but it was too late. Suddenly, his wife's desperate cries for help echoed in his ears. Now, in the present, the morgue door locks itself. Blood seeps from the freezer units. A cold voice calls out his name, but for some reason, as if something had possessed him, Seon-ji hesitated. Instead of running, he walked toward the open morgue drawer, holding up his lighter to take a closer look inside. In the blink of an eye, Seon-ji was yanked into the morgue drawer. Above him, a mummified corpse hovered ominously in the air. As Seon-ji screamed in terror, the mummy's bandages began to tighten around him, wrapping him up like a cocoon. Just as Seon-ji was about to meet his end, the morgue drawer suddenly swung open. He was pulled up by Ji-yoon, but in Seon-ji's eyes, the person standing before him wasn't Ji-yoon, it was his dead wife. Panicked, he scrambled out of the morgue drawer, crawling desperately toward the door, but before he could escape, a pair of ghostly hands reached for his head. In the next moment, under Ji-yoon's horrified gaze, Seon-ji twisted his own neck, snapping it. When the police arrived, Ji-yoon was immediately arrested as the prime suspect. During interrogation, she had no way to explain why she was at the crime scene. Desperate to clear her name, Ji-yoon told them about the shadowy figure she saw. But Ki-cheol didn't believe in ghosts. With both murder cases mirroring Ji-yoon's webtoons, he was convinced she staged the killings herself to boost her career. Under Ki-cheol's relentless questioning, Ji-yoon finally broke down and confessed. After her first manga became a huge success, Ji-yoon was signed to an exclusive contract for a massive sum of money. But after that, she hit a creative block. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't come up with a new story. As her editor pressured her for deadlines, Ji-yoon grew more and more anxious. Then, one day, she received an anonymous email. Inside was a fully completed manga manuscript, one that had never been published anywhere. She had no idea who sent it or why, but she did know that if she failed to submit something soon, she'd face a massive breach of contract penalty. In the end, greed won over reason. Ji-yoon took the manuscript, colored it, and submitted it as her own. When the police examined Ji-yoon's computer, they found the email. Comparing the files, they confirmed Ji-yoon had plagiarized the work. The next step? Tracing the sender's location, and what they uncovered only made things more mysterious. The email's origin led them to a specific apartment complex, the same place where both Seon-ji and Ji-yoon had once lived. Even stranger, Officer Yansu discovered CNGI had a daughter, Seo-hyun. Rumors claimed she could predict people's deaths. Because of this, the other residents shunned her, but one person didn't, Ji-yoon. Yet, after Ji-yoon moved away, Seo-hyun disappeared. Hearing this, Ki-cheol's instincts told him Seo-hyun and the email sender were connected. He immediately confronted Ji-yoon, demanding to know everything about Seo-hyun. As Ji-yoon spoke, the story flashed back to 5 years ago. Back then, Ji-yoon was a struggling webtoon artist. Every submission she sent was rejected. She felt like the whole world had abandoned her. There was no kindness anywhere. One day, she saw a girl, Seo-hyun, being bullied. In that moment, Ji-yoon saw herself in her. She stepped in, chased the bullies away, and from that day on, they became inseparable. Seo-hyun even moved in with Ji-yoon, and the two became like sisters, but their happiness was short-lived. One night, a furious family barged into their home. They beat Seo-hyun while screaming that she was a curse. It turned out that Seo-hyun would unintentionally draw things, and those drawings came true. That morning, she had drawn a sketch of a girl in a car accident. That afternoon, a little girl from the apartment complex died in a car crash exactly like the drawing. Blaming Seo-hyun, the grieving parents attacked her. Ji-yoon managed to scare them off with a knife. But that night, her home was set on fire, and after that, Seo-hyun vanished. After hearing Ji-yoon's story, Ki-cheol brought her back to the abandoned apartment complex. His gut told him there were still clues hidden here. The place had been empty for years. Following the traced IP address, they ended up in a basement unit, Ji-yoon's old apartment. Inside, there was nothing but a desk, a computer, and a printer. Ki-cheol tapped the keyboard. The screen lit up with a webtoon draft. Seeing this, he smirked. He had a feeling he now knew who the real suspect was. But just as they were about to leave, Ji-yoon suddenly ran off, leaving Ki-cheol behind. Moments before, she had received a text from Seo-hyun. The message said, "Meet me in the backyard." Nervous but hopeful, Ji-yoon rushed to the meeting spot, but Seo-hyun was nowhere to be seen. Just as she started thinking it was a prank, a shadow loomed behind her. Before she could react, bam! A brick slammed into her head. The attacker? Officer Yansu. Yansu abducted Ji-yoon and took her to an abandoned slaughterhouse. He demanded to know where Seo-hyun was hiding, because while investigating the case, Yansu had seen Chapter 3 of Ji-yoon's webtoon, and the protagonist of that chapter was him. Years ago, when Yansu was still a rookie cop, he was driving down a highway near the slaughterhouse. While calling his fiancée to share the good news about his promotion, he accidentally hit a little girl. The child, covered in blood, was pinned under his car, weakly calling for help. But in that moment, greed won over conscience. If this incident came to light, he would lose everything: his job, his future, his fiancée. So he left the girl to die alone in the rain. Now, years later, his own child was about to be born, but his darkest secret had resurfaced, exposed in Ji-yoon's manga. He couldn't allow this to happen, since Ji-yoon didn't know where Seo-hyun was. Yansu snapped. He raised his axe, ready to kill another witness. Just then, the lights flickered. A small, bloodied hand slowly crawled onto Yansu's shoulder. The girl he left to die had returned. In that moment, Ki-cheol burst in, but before he could act, Yansu suddenly turned his gun on himself. Tears streamed down his face as he begged Ki-cheol for help, insisting this wasn't his doing. Then, as a bloody hand gripped the gun's handle, bang! A gunshot shattered the silence. Yansu collapsed, dead by his own hand. A police officer kidnapping a suspect and dying under mysterious circumstances? The police chief was furious. If this leaked to the media, it would be a disaster. But what enraged him most was Ki-cheol's insistence that Yansu was killed by a vengeful ghost. If the press got wind of this supernatural claim, it would be like dropping a bomb into deep waters. So the chief ordered Ki-cheol to declare it a suicide. After calming Ki-cheol down, he warned Ji-yoon to keep her mouth shut. They would pin everything on Seo-hyun and close the case. Just like that, Ji-yoon was released without charges. The moment Ji-yoon got home, her computer chimed with a new email. Her hands trembled as she clicked on it. Another anonymous manuscript. But this time, the protagonist wasn't Yansu, and the timeline shifted back 5 years. But this version of events was very different from the story Ji-yoon had told Ki-cheol. Yes, Ji-yoon had rescued Seo-hyun from bullies. Yes, Seo-hyun had moved in with her. But then, Ji-yoon discovered Seo-hyun's secret. Seo-hyun's drawings could predict death, and Ji-yoon saw an opportunity. Every time Seo-hyun started sketching, Ji-yoon handed her a blank sheet to make her draw separately. Using those drawings, Ji-yoon became a rising star in the webtoon industry and landed a major contract. Then, on the very day she received her publishing deal, she came home to find her apartment in flames, and the one who set it on fire was Seo Hyun. Seo Hyun had figured it out. If these webtoons were published, the spirits of the dead would escape through them and seek revenge. She couldn't let that happen. So, in one desperate act of kindness, she burned everything. But Ji-yoon was too blinded by ambition. She didn't care who died as long as she got what she wanted. When Seo Hyun tried to stop her, Ji-yoon grabbed a crystal ball and smashed it over her head. Then, ignoring everything else, she ran into the fire to save the manuscripts. As she tried to escape, Seo Hyun, half-conscious and bleeding, grabbed Ji-yoon's leg, begging her to stop. During the struggle, Seo Hyun accidentally scratched Ji-yoon's finger. That was when Ji-yoon snapped. She pinned Seo Hyun to the ground and strangled her with all her strength. As Seo Hyun gasped for breath, Ji-yoon screamed, "I need this power more than you do. If you die, give it to me." And then, Seo Hyun stopped breathing. From that moment on, Ji-yoon gained the ability to hear the voices of vengeful spirits. Back in the present, Ji-yoon returned to the basement. There, she found her missing ring, and at that moment, all her memories came flooding back. The reason she could hear spirits' voices? The ring. The reason she had forgotten everything? She lost the ring. For years, she had been traveling between her home and the apartment, collecting the spirit stories, making them into webtoons, and sending them to herself via email. Now that she remembered the truth, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: guilt. And at that moment, Seo Hyun's ghost appeared, tears streaming down her face. Ji-yoon finally whispered, "I'm sorry." Hearing those words, Seo Hyun smiled and cried too. Not all spirits seek revenge, and not all humans deserve to be called human. As Ki Cheol pieced everything together, he arrived at the basement to arrest Ji-yoon, but something had changed in her. Now fully aware of her power, Ji-yoon grabbed an axe and attacked. Ki Cheol had a gun. She never stood a chance, but Ji-yoon didn't panic. Instead, she pointed to the wall. There, Ki Cheol saw a new manga panel, and just like that, the truth about Yansu's death was rewritten. That night, Yansu didn't actually kill himself. After saving him, Ki Cheol, in a fit of rage, beat him mercilessly. Then, in the struggle, the gun accidentally fired. Yansu was killed by Ki Cheol. Panicked, Ki Cheol wiped his prints off the gun and staged it as a suicide. Then, he blamed it on a ghost. Staring at the manga, Ki Cheol knew Ji-yoon was going to expose him. He raised his gun, aiming at her, but before he could shoot, Yansu's ghost appeared. A bloody hand gripped his wrist, and just like that, Ki Cheol met the same fate as Yansu. Years later, in an interview, Ji-yoon was asked, "Do you believe in ghosts?" She flatly denied it, and in that moment, the audience realizes this entire film might just be another one of Ji-yoon's webtoons, because one question remains unanswered: where is Seo Hyun's body?